Hello everyone and welcome to another video commentary. In this one I'm going to be talking a little bit about social support and family communication is kind of an example of that. Let's get into it. In this video I'm mostly going to cover the general idea of social support. This is largely coming from our assigned readings, the required readings, and then I'm going to explore some examples from some specific contexts, including military and end-of-life discourses, as well as just the general challenge of people in crisis. And hopefully we've got some takeaways that can help you in your day-to-day life and better understand this concept in general. So let's begin by discussing what social support is and why you should care. Social support. So this is generally defined as behaviors that whether directly or indirectly communicate to an individual that they are valued and cared for by others. Sounds pretty straightforward, doesn't it? We all have a need to not simply exist as an individual, but we are social animals. Why do we need this social support? Well, talking about problems with family and friends in particular is important to an individual and it's important to the relational well-being of those specific relationships. People do best in particular in difficult situations when they feel like they are informed, involved, and cared for by their close others, as well as weak ties or people who aren't super close to you. This is hugely important to our sense of self or identity, no matter how individualistic a culture you come from or how introverted you are, you still have social support and needs. That's how our brains are wired. That's how our reality is wired. And so this has some pretty significant consequences, particularly when people don't really like to talk about it. Let's take a moment to talk about the different kinds of social support. Well, for one, there's instrumental support. This is the kind of support that you might think of most immediately, where we're simply doing something for someone or freeing them up. This could be picking the kids up from school. I got dinner tonight, honey. Whatever it might be. If someone is feeling overwhelmed or overloaded, well, it's best to sometimes lighten their load. Sometimes that's good enough. But there are other kinds of social support as well. We have informational support. This is the kind of support you might get from a doctor, for instance, or support groups or the internet. Uh, if you're a Reddit user, I am. Sometimes when I search a question on the internet, if I don't want to get an AI answer and I want to hear what real humans' experiences are with a specific thing, I'll just type Reddit into the end of my query and see what people are talking about in a specific community. If it's not dedicated exactly to what I'm looking for, it's adjacent to or related to it, and you can see what people are saying to each other. Of course, you got to vet information on the internet, but that's nothing new. We might also get informational support from our doctor. If we go in and we're sick and we say, I don't know what's going on, hopefully they can give us information that can help us make better decisions, more informed decisions, and feel comfortable, a bit more comfortable about our situation. So information can help reduce uncertainty, which is valuable when we're trying to increase our agency. And that's also valuable when we are struggling and we need to make decisions or what have you. We also have esteem support. This is making someone feel valued and competent. This is really, really important too. It's not usually good enough to just solve people's problems for them or just give them information. We also want them to feel valued and competent, because if we don't succeed at that, then that individual is not really benefiting that much because they've got their own life to live, right? So esteem is part of this. It's part of our own individual agency. It's also part of our identity. This can help us improve our self-efficacy, much like reducing uncertainty can, making sure that the people around us think that we are worthwhile. That can improve our self-efficacy, that can improve our health decisions, that can improve our day-to-day life. People who are experiencing problems with suicidal ideation, for instance, often express feeling like a burden to people around them, like they just aren't, I don't serve any purpose here. I'm hurting the people around me, and that then starts becoming an option, is to remove themselves from the picture. Well, esteem support can really help people recognize that they're not a burden, they're appreciated, they're valued by other people. Now, additionally, we have affective or emotional support. This is probably the other thing that pops into your head when you think about what social support would look like. This is pretty much exactly what it sounds like, which is providing comfort and enabling emotional regulation. We want to draw a distinction between emotional regulation and emotional restraint. Emotional restraint would be kind of unequivocally trying not to express emotions. This is a characteristic of people who might be conflict avoidant, for instance, might have anxious conflict or personality disorders, but primarily avoidant people learn to suppress their emotions so as not to upset people around them. That's not the same as emotional regulation. We want to achieve the goal of emotional regulation, and that involves emotional intelligence, which means being able to describe and identify what someone is feeling, both in ourselves and others. That's much more healthy. That's the goal, because emotions are, yeah, they're in our head, but they're real. They have a direct effect on our bodies, on our physiological health, and and of course our mental health. And there's almost a fallacy in trying to separate those two things out. But emotions are real in the sense that we have to deal with them, and that doesn't just mean tightening them up. People who are anxious also seem to experience a lot of gut disorders, for instance. We can't just like ball up our emotions and keep them inside. And there are a lot of non-mental reasons for that. Now, we also want to recognize that with all these different kinds of support, different people have different support needs. This can be a source of tension if you are better prepared to offer one source of support, such as instrumental support, but less prepared to offer something like emotional support if you are an individual like I just described, who's not super comfortable with expressing emotions or diagnosing them or talking about them in general. Your default might be, I'm going to give instrumental support, but that's not always what people need. Regardless, with all of these different kinds of support, a sense of agency is a very important part of performing well in crisis and just in day-to-day life. It's an important part of our mental wellness and our mental health. So let's dig into this a little bit deeper and see what else we can learn about social support. Moving on here, when we're usually talking about social support, we often talk about this in the context of stressful situations or crisis situations. And the idea here is that people do better when they've got social support, yes, but resilience, right? Resilience, for instance, when we are in crisis, well, we have more resilience when we've got good, strong social networks and social support. This is kind of referred to as the buffering hypothesis. Even when we're not in stressful situations, knowing that if we find ourselves in crisis, someone's got your back, that does a lot for a person's mental well-being. Now, the required reading by Goldsmith was mostly talking about enacted social support. And this is important. The argument there is that, well, social support really matters most when it's a thing that is done, not just when it's an imaginary thing in the background. That's what we're talking about with enacted social support. And so the remainder of the readings that we'll discuss will look at some specific situations in which social support is enacted well or not so well. But when we're dealing with enacted social support, this is important because that's what helps the individual cope with a crisis. And a crisis is kind of defined as a situation where the stressor exceeds our coping ability, but we can expand our coping ability by having good social support. That's what enacted social support is supposed to do, is to facilitate coping so that the individual is not on their own. Goldsmith is particularly interested in enacted social support. So do we even have social support if it isn't enacted? Well, that's an interesting discussion in its own right, but certainly it's more difficult to measure and account for if we don't see it in action. One of the contexts that is described in this classic literature is troubles talk, right? When we're talking about problems. This may feel really self-explanatory and kind of on the nose for you, but this is the meat and potatoes of health communication, because most of our health communication is not happening in the doctor's office. It's happening day to day as we talk to our friends and family and acquaintances. This is referred to as troubles talk. When we talk about our problems, pretty straightforward there. But the thing about troubles talk is it kind of disrupts business as usual. That is a concern for providers of social support and receivers of social support. That might be a barrier that we'll see in a little bit, that the disruption of normalcy, that can be a problem for us. And that can make this, doing this well, right, providing social support and receiving it, that can make that kind of difficult because that's a barrier. Disrupting normalcy is a barrier. If you think back to the health belief model, and we're talking about potential benefits versus potential barriers. Well, talking about awkward things or sad things, that's a barrier. We don't want to talk about these things necessarily, but even if we don't want to, we do need to do something about it. So sometimes this is harder in strong tie relationships. A strong tie relationship would be like your close others, your family, your friends. And that's another challenge too, because those are the people we really count on to help us feel better. And it's harder in these relationships because there's often a strong desire to fix things. If you're talking to your spouse, they are so tied up in your life, right? They have strong overlap of groups and actions and feelings and thoughts that they want to fix things for you and you want to fix things for them. And so that can get in the way of things as well. We don't want to end up just giving instrumental support when someone really sometimes just needs a hug, right? But ultimately, social support in all its forms, we're talking about communication. This is health communication in its purest form. Now, I wanted to take a moment to mention the ring theory here. This is coming from a health communication textbook that I teach from in 363. So perhaps you're familiar with this if you've taken that class with me before. But what we're describing here is how to do social support well when someone is in crisis. And the main thing to take away from this is recognizing that when someone's in crisis, we don't want to heap more on them. We don't want to give them more to worry about. And so this ring model is describing comfort goes in towards the crisis, but dumping should really go out. You don't want to dump into the crisis. You don't want to dump into the people who are closer to it. So again, the definition of crisis is a stressor that exceeds our normal coping ability. You could be a really strong and resilient person and be able to deal with a lot of stuff, but we all have our limits, right? And if there's chronic stress, such as if you are part of what has been referred to as a sandwich generation, so that means a caretaker who's taking care of their children and their parents, for instance, very common in intergenerational households. Well, you may not get a whole lot of time to recharge yourself. And so you could be really strong, but then who knows what could a small crisis disrupting your life could be a big deal if it exceeds your normal coping ability, because your coping ability is worn down, right? You don't have a whole lot of coping anymore because you're busy coping for everyone else. Well, that's one example of what a crisis could be, but a health condition, a new diagnosis, a tragic one such as like cancer, right? That's super disrupting to our normal coping ability. Most people are going to have a really hard time dealing with that kind of major life change. That's normal, that's natural. So ring theory is basically saying that if we want help in crisis situations, we have to probably be a better listener for the person who is in crisis. We may be tempted to relate to them by saying, I know how you feel, this thing happened to me, and then go off and start talking about ourselves. That doesn't help someone who's in crisis. That makes them feel worse often. That heaps more bad feelings on someone who's already struggling. If they're coming to you to talk about something that's exceeded their ability to cope, that's not the time to tell your story about a similar experience. You may think we're just relating, but often what happens there is that we're dumping, and we don't want to do that. We should seek support from people who are farther from the crisis, is kind of the lesson from ring theory, right? So if you are in that first circle, the immediate family and best friends, well, you're going to need to vent to someone too. But you shouldn't vent to the people who are suffering from the crisis, right? You should probably go outward to someone else. You may be reluctant to do that. You may say, well, I don't want to like talk to my acquaintances about my niece's brain cancer. Yeah. That's understandable, but there's always someone who's a little bit farther from the crisis. This doesn't have to be someone who's farther from you, just farther from the crisis, right? We don't want to dump in. We want to comfort in. That's the point of ring theory. So that gives us a little preview of what good social support would look like. Let's discuss some of the characteristics of enacted social support as described by Goldsmith. Some of this stuff is kind of technical, researchy, theoretical, but it all has real applications for us normal humans who are trying to be better social supporters. But what does enacted social support look like according to the definitions provided by Goldsmith? Well, for one thing, it involves meaningful action. We are not just passive participants. We're not just there off in the background, like, oh, they know I'm here if they need me. No, we're talking about enacted social support. We're talking about actually doing the thing, actually having the conversations, actually trying to help the individual. One of the assumptions that goes along with this is that, well, when we're having these communication acts, we recognize that it's possible to share meaning of messages. That may sound a little on the nose for you. Again, if you are like, well, this is stating the obvious. Yeah, kind of, but by operationalizing this stuff, we can make better sense of it. So this is an assumption that we make, that shared meaning is possible of those messages. Now, it's actually harder. So this can help us explain some of the ring theory stuff, right? It's possible to push people apart by trying to be more supportive. So again, if we're dumping on that individual instead of listening, we might end up pushing them away, farther away. We might not be listening to what they're trying to communicate. They may not know what they're trying to communicate. And so this is discursive. It is a conversation. It involves listening, and it involves characterizing messages and their meanings. Likewise, the effect of this stuff should be measurable. And ideally so would success, right? Did the person feel better? Did they solve their problem, whatever it might be? We also want to talk about enacted social support as being situated in a context. It's rhetorical in this way. We use this word rhetoric and rhetorical to describe specific messages in specific contexts. That's a communication approach here, but think about how that's useful to you as well. We want to think about then, well, what skills are useful in the most contexts or across different contexts? That's good for us to study too. That allows us for more adaptive message design so that we can be more successful. Also, enacted social support is going to be attending to other needs outside of the problem we're trying to solve, or the support we're trying to provide in that specific instance, beyond that context. Those needs could be relational, right? So if you're talking to your close ties, you're talking to a family member or a spouse or a significant other, there are relationship implications in having any conversation. And in particular, this kind of troubles talk conversation can have significant consequences. And finally, there's also the identity needs, right? Not just for the relationship, but for the individual, both individuals involved. So now all these terms and conditions are being provided by Goldsmith to kind of talk about how we study social support. But they all have implications for doing social support as well. We'll look at some examples of these things in some context to make more sense of this. Now, I want to turn our attention to one of the optional readings here. This is kind of describing, for lack of a better word, a double-edged sword of social support. So in this article, we are looking at the fact that stressful life events don't just affect the individual, they affect those around them. And social support doesn't just affect the individual who's in crisis, for instance. It affects the supporters as well. And so this study was looking at specific kind of messaging, specific kind of communication from someone who's seeking social support and how that's received or perceived by the listeners. So one of the things they found here was that supporters tended to respond negatively to an individual who presented themselves as coping poorly. That has some consequences for us, right? So if someone comes up and says, I'm having a really hard time and I don't know if I can manage this or whatever, the listener is, of course, going to have a negative reaction to that. They're going to feel a heightened state of, perhaps negative emotional arousal. They might be afraid. They might be anxious. They might be mad. They might be worried about the situation because, hey, this is kind of bad news, right? They also discovered here that supporters responded more positively to people who say they are coping well. So if the person seeking social support comes up to their close ties and says, yeah, it's really hard, but I'm doing fine. I think I can manage this. I think I can get through this. Well, yeah, the listener responds more positively to that. This might just be a lesson of framing. Again, if we've got positive framing, that makes people feel better. However, we do want to question what sort of behavior this encourages. And as another aside here, the fact that this is coming from 1990 doesn't really make this information less relevant because this is informing a lot of subsequent social support research. And this is pretty accurate, I think, right? And perhaps we now, 30 years in the future here, 30 plus years, can recognize the consequences of that, right? Well, how do we treat mental health? How do we treat talking about our problems? I don't think it's changed a ton. It's changed a little bit. We've gotten more open about talking about the importance of mental health, but people are still pretty resistant to seek help, to seek mental health, to seek social support. That's a challenge that we do still need to work through as a country. But this might be part of it, right? What kind of behavior does it encourage? That means you're encouraged to have a stiff upper lip and show that you're stronger than perhaps you are feeling. But there is another important lesson in this research, is that a balanced approach works too. It doesn't have to just be positive. Um, we can be a little more open about things that we are doing okay with and things that maybe we could use some help with. That balanced approach didn't have the same negative response as simply saying, I'm not doing so good. All right, so this has implications for all of us. And perhaps it has implications for the role of honesty, realism, and openness. That's no surprise because we're talking about social relationships. We're talking about people's needs and expectations. It's very hard to have successful relationships without a high degree of honesty, realism, and openness. The challenge, of course, one of the many challenges, is recognizing that when people are in crisis, they may not be super rational. They may not be prepared to discuss things in this kind of strategic way. Um, but I think it's important for us to think of our crises in this way as well, right? People adjust to crises by solving problems they can and adapting to things that they cannot. That necessarily involves this kind of balanced approach. So as we continue to think about social support, we also want to think about how we respond to crisis and try to cultivate this perspective where, yeah, I can fix some of these problems, but I can't control everything. I can't fix everything. Uh, that's being honest with ourselves. So I think doing so can help both our problem and also the social support kind of situation. Moving on to another reading now. This one is discussing military issues. This is Peck and Parcell back in 2020. Um, I have the honor of saying that Brittany Peck is my wife, and so I'm pretty familiar with this research and how she performed it. And she found some really interesting stuff. This article was successful enough um, that she actually recently had a meeting with a, a clinical psychologist who works at the Pentagon for the Navy, trying to improve mental health support. So, hey, research works and people are listening and things can happen. But this is kind of an example of what she was talking about with that fellow. Uh, Military members are unlikely to seek mental health support. This is kind of the premise of this research, and that's something that you may be aware of or you might not be aware of. Specifically, through this research, I'm talking to military members, but not just military members, their spouses, right? So this is research looking at a family unit and talking about the challenge of mental health and getting mental health support and being supportive of each other too. And they identified through this research several different dilemmas that were commonly reported by these members. And, 6 specifically emerged out of this line of research. One, there's a dilemma in recognizing that a problem exists without implying or feeling abnormal. This is a barrier to people being able to communicate effectively. 2, encouraging help without implying weakness. So spouses have a dilemma where they want to encourage their spouse to get help with their trauma or whatever it may be, just whatever they're struggling with. But they don't want to do so with implying weakness. That's a challenge in military culture. Being persistent but patient. So again, if you're trying to support your spouse who's been deployed and they don't want to talk about things, you might have to be persistent to get them to open up a little bit, or at least just talk to you about the ways in which you can help. But that takes a lot of patience because it's not going to happen right away sometimes. Additionally, the service members express wanting openness without implying understanding. And I assume this goes both ways as well, but wanting to talk to their partners but not wanting to imply that they would be able to understand that, right? There's this kind of false calculus where you assume that talking to someone about this problem, like they should be able to understand it and help you, and specifically, but as we've just discussed, that's not always how social support works. Uh, and additionally, the desire of the service member to get help, but how the military context itself impedes that process. It is not just military members being unwilling to seek mental health. They are kind of discouraged from that because if you are um, assessed to be unfit for your job, well, your job is actually in danger. And this is an issue in military culture that, again, people like that fellow from the Pentagon are trying to address. They're trying to address this issue a little bit more and trying to figure out ways in which they can fix this. And there's also this dilemma of a reluctance to disrupt normalcy, as we discussed with the troubled talks side of things. There's this inherent recognition that if we talk about this stuff, we don't get to pretend things are all normal. We have to talk about this stuff. And we don't want to talk about this stuff. We want things to be normal. We want them to be good. So these are 6 common dilemmas that Peck and Parcell identified through this research in talking to military members and their significant others. So this also takes 3 different forms, which is also worth mentioning here. One is this is my dilemma, another is that it's your dilemma, and then the third is that it's our dilemma. So you've got this kind of 6x3 situation with these dilemmas. That can get pretty complicated pretty quick, but they do have some suggestions as to what we can do about this. So what are some of those solutions? Well, for one thing, providers can learn more about military culture to understand that there is a stigma for mental health and that not doing so well is seen as weakness that should be discouraged at all costs. But the costs of that culture is probably quite a bit more devastating than simply getting mental health, right? Because people, if they're not getting mental health help, then they're probably not doing so good. And that probably will affect their combat readiness. But if they get help, that kind of solves that problem because the help does, in fact, help. So, but that is a challenge. That is a context that providers need to be aware of and they need to learn more about. Then there's the secondary challenge here of addressing that stigma directly in the military. Some of the service members suggested things like, well, if everyone had to do it, right? If I didn't have to go to my superior officer and say, I'm struggling, well, that's a scary conversation to have, but if everyone had to do it, so there was some talk about, well, maybe like a mandatory mental health kind of thing would be helpful because then we're in it with our buddies, we're in it with our unit, we're in it with our officers, and everyone is getting resources that can be helpful potentially to everyone. Well, that's one way we can do it, and that could help address that stigma a little bit in the military. But this is, again, we're talking about changing a culture. That's not something you can engineer necessarily. We have to encourage these kinds of changes. And likewise, that also overlaps with this third solution, which would be a creative form of delivery of the mental health care. So for example, if the whole unit after post-deployment, they have some mental health resources and they're encouraged to lean on each other, that could be a creative way to encourage mental health and make things a bit better. Now, finally, the other optional reading here would be the one talking about end-of-life discourse goals. So Scott and Coughlin in 2012 were examining, through discourse analysis, how end-of-life conversations are tough. So whether this is a terminal cancer diagnosis or someone simply approaching the end of their life by old age, we don't like to talk about that. We don't like to talk about death. We don't like to talk about illness. We don't like to talk about what happens when that person's gone. We would much rather adhere to that illusion of normalcy, but these conversations are important too. And they go best when family members are able to, one, address the task of discussing decisions, such as, is there going to be a advanced care directive? Is there going to be a do not resuscitate order? Is there going to be, can we get our will in place? Like those kind of really sticky things that people don't want to talk about, but we have to talk about. So these conversations go best when people do address those task-related needs of the conversation, but they also go best when we are able to attend to those other aspects around the conversation, whether that's identity and the relational implications, as mentioned earlier in this commentary. That's going to make these conversations go quite a bit better. And so people do better when they're not just doing tasks, but also relational maintenance in these things. But again, neither of those things can happen if people are not being open and talking to each other. Only 60% of people actually have these conversations. If you are too scared to talk about what happens after you die, that is putting a greater burden on your family, not a lesser burden, because it's got to be dealt with. Funerals are expensive. Estates have to be managed. And there's also those really important emotional and relational implications of like, it's going to really suck when you're gone. It's going to be really hard. And I'm going to miss you. And I'm going to miss you because I love you. But that's such an important part of, that's so important to say. It's so important to have those conversations. And so we don't want to neglect that either. Now, I guess for conclusions here, I'd like to wrap up this video by considering how can we appropriately give and receive social support. Hopefully by the end of this video, you've had some examples of how we can do this better. And they have some common themes, I think. One is to recognize that we all need social support. Again, no one is an island. It's all fine and good to be like, oh, I'm resilient. Oh, I'm good. Mental health, meh. That's only for weak people. Except it's not, right? And part of being strong, part of being resilient is being able to rely on social support and being able to seek help when you need it, because emotions don't go away just because we want them to, just because we think they're stupid and it's all in our head. And that's not, I've got a problem here to deal with. I don't have time for emotions. It sucks. You've got them and you can't get rid of them just by wishing them away. Again, there are real health implications to people, like, and I say real health, like it's different, like mental health. These things are not separable. We cannot distinguish between physiological health and mental. We can't separate them. Those distinctions are convenient, not accurate. That's probably the third time I've said this today, so I guess I'm on a roll. Not in this video, but in other videos. But that distinction is not accurate. The relationship between our emotions and our physical well-being is inextricably bound. People who suffer from anxiety often suffer from digestive issues. That's not a coincidence, gang. Gut health, your microbiome probably also affects your mood. None of that is a coincidence. And the more we as a society pretend that our emotions are separate from our health, the worse off we're going to be. So step one is recognizing that we all need social support, no matter how strong we are. Everyone has their thresholds, and we need it. All right. Step two is understanding that's not an easy thing to do. Again, we can't just snap our fingers and change a culture. I think that our culture is getting better about recognizing the importance of mental health, but we still kind of keep it at arm's length. We kind of still say, oh yeah, of course mental health is important. If you need mental health, you need it. Go get it. Obviously. I don't need it, but you definitely do. You should go get help. That's really great. That's really healthy. Oh no, I'm good. I'm good. Yeah. Those childhood traumas they're in the past. I don't need to worry about that. Though I do have a hard time expressing emotions in general, and you get the idea. This is complicated. It's complicated for everyone. It is in fact complicated for me. I'm being snarky and kind of doing a bit there, but this is a challenge for me too. It's a challenge for all of us because none of us want to admit that we're struggling because we don't want to appear weak. We don't want to be weak, more importantly. But we also want to recognize the complexity of this situation in the sense that everyone has different needs and expectations. Some people, everyone has these different expectations about appearing weak or even being weak. And they also have different expectations about what they truly need. So this is discursive. We do have to negotiate these things. They are conversations to be had. And that's kind of the point here. But ultimately, I think the most important thing to get, like, I can go through bullet point after bullet point of different recommendations of how to be a good listener, how to give good social support. But the number one thing is to be a listener. It is to be there. You want to be there for people, and you want them to know that you're there for them. So we do want to try to be a good listener, and we do want to demonstrate that we care about each other's well-being. That's, honestly, that's the most important thing. Not solving someone's problems for them, not fixing things, but reminding them that they're not alone. If I can't do anything about your situation, so be it. I mean, I you can't literally fix most problems for other people. So especially if you can't solve their problem. But that's the good news, right? Is that you don't have to. If you want to help people, you need to demonstrate that you're there and you want to be able to do anything you can for them, or whatever's practical. What you get the idea, that you want to help them if able, and the reason for that is because you care about them. That is social support. So start with that, stick with that, and I hope that these considerations will help you do that a little bit better. And I hope they encourage you to think about what you truly need and get social support. None of us are alone in this, and it doesn't really help to convince ourselves that we are. So on that note, I hope you're all doing well, and let me know if there's anything that I can do to be there for you.